And here we are for a live episode on a Tuesday that I don't know if we've ever actually done at 2 p.m. Eastern time live episode. This is going to be what? Season 6, episode 21. We'll probably do an intro before this, but uh, I'm feeling all sorts of different things. Not really sure how to say it, but I don't know. We were just talking about this, and then we were like, all right, you want to start live streaming now? And the sort of sense that, like, you're not on a journey at all. Like, there's nothing to improve at all for the sake of improving yourself. It's almost like anything you jump into is just a product of, well, this is what's happening right now. And I am what I am, and I'm going to express what I'm going to express. And there's going to be certain things that come up in experiences, and that's all a component of, like, I was thinking like your lot in life, but it's not that at all. It's like your story, your personal experiences, like everything you've experienced up until you're not doing it for the sake of improving yourself, but you're just living, like you're just life interacting with itself, the universe expressing itself. And that perception is always there. The thoughts about yourself, the focuses are always there. But as long as you think that you're improving something, or that there is something wrong that you're doing right now, the story can feel like it comes back, but it's not even a story until you start filling it in. It's just a feeling. Oh, it's just a feeling. And it's like a story kind of, I don't know, gets layered on top of it as I think about what happened instead of just what's happening being the expression of process without it being personal.
It's like we try to rationalize the feeling. Like, this is where the feeling's coming from. Like we said before, it's never necessarily where the feeling's coming from. But when we look at it that way, it gives us a really simplified kind of view. Well, then I need to do this. This is the path out. This is the journey, right? But that journey is dependent on the you that's journeying. Is in fact the journey outside of the you that's journeying. But what's tricky about that is that you're trying to escape something that only exists by virtue of you giving shit about it. Right? Like, the reason you want to escape is the suffering. The suffering is the resistance that you have to the narrative that you continue to invest in. So you could just not invest in it, which doesn't mean the brain's not going to create one. It's going to create infinite narratives. You're going to have a feeling, it's going to go, it's this, right? But that's tied to infinite other things. Not only that, it's tied to infinite other feelings, because they're all a spectrum. And so the alternative to trying to escape your suffering would be to embrace your suffering, right? To stop exacerbating your suffering by running from it, by fighting it. Right? This was a conversation we were having on TikTok, or somebody was having with me on TikTok, and it was very much the point of, the harder you run from this, scarier it becomes. Right? Whereas if you just accept it, it starts to teach you, and it starts to teach you that a lot of the suffering, quote unquote, is just resistance to the experience that you're having of yourself, because it doesn't coincide with that idea of yourself that you're holding on to. That's really it. It's so funny because typically it's like, well, you can get better at things. Yeah, okay, yeah, sure, absolutely. But you as a person aren't getting better. You're just doing something more. And that's reality. That's awareness. And it's funny, I was thinking about this because, it's often said the universe is entropy, that it's going towards a greater and greater degree of chaos. But I wonder about that, because it seems like the balancing factor to that is awareness, consciousness at play, like the awareness of life itself, because that's ultimately what finds its own order when you allow that intelligence to do its own thing. But we don't want to do that. Instead, we're like, no, there's a way that all of this suffering can end, because that makes sense to me. It's like, yeah, but it's super biased, and it's really dependent on a lot of the things that you're holding on to. And worse, it's dependent on how much you're suffering, which is why you should be suspicious. Right? Like any strategy that is the result of your suffering or fear is going to be tainted by that suffering or fear, which is why a drowning person will pull someone else down with them.
And all of that desire to get out of suffering or things you do in response to, I guess, any type of suffering, but the psychological suffering is just piling on top of it. Like it's piling on top of this thing that's got to forever be improved. Like there's no way to be improved, period. You just kind of get to a spot where you feel like you are enough. And then based on how you feel, it's like, all right, good enough. Is it enough? But it's still all there. Like it's still all under the surface. Like it's just piled on top of the suffering. It's like distractions from the suffering. Improving myself in some way, shape, or form is like, turning my head, continuing to turn my head away, but it's still like all that stuff is there. And so as I improve, as long as I'm on that sort of trajectory towards improving something because of some reason, like for some purpose, like doing things for a purpose, I'm going to lose weight. It's like, I'm going to lose weight because it's going to make me more, or I'm going to lose weight because right now my experience is I'm feeling kind of heavy and I'm just going to do it because of my experience right now, like within myself, how things are going. But it's not anything outside of that. Like it's not for a reason. It's not for anything about some subjective measurement, like some idea. So even the things, the components of, your experiences that you deem to be wrong or bad or something that you got to overcome. Like it's not, none of those are even things to overcome at all. It's just if certain fears come up or are still there, it's like looking at those and exploring them when they arrive in your situation can be the case. But even the fears, it's like if those are things that you're trying to overcome, it's like you're trying to overcome them for you, or you're just recognizing fear itself and where that stems from, and you do things as they come up just because, but they're not sought. It's like they're not sought after. Because if they're sought after, it's you on some trajectory somewhere. Oh, it's not even that. Oh.
This is the fun part about it, is that you're like, oh, okay. And somebody put it here, the notion of healing implies there's another place to be other than where you're at. And what's funny about the brain is that it goes, yeah. And now I'm going to put myself on a trajectory of how close I am to realizing that. I'm going to idealize the end of that there's another, when I let go of that other place to be, I will be healed, and thus there will be no suffering. So the brain immediately creates another fucking fictional path immediately. Right? This is why there is a such thing as the spiritual ego. This is why it becomes important to get to the point where you understand that to let go means to even let go of the concept of letting go. Because that implies that there's something to hold on to, which is a product of the attachment itself. Right? And so at the end of the day, there's no path to walk. This is it. Welcome. This is it. Welcome. Is that enough for you? Is that enough for you? Or are you immediately going to reach for a path? Because the path that actually is not the path that you see in your mind. The path that is the path you're walking. right? Which means that it unfolds one step at a time. But we'd want to see multiple steps ahead. We want to see all the different paths that we could walk on and have control over them according to our preferences, as opposed to actually just letting go of the path. Because that's the ultimate end of the journey. The narrow path that few travel, blah, 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 leads to right where you are. The question is, are you willing to let go of the journey and what it's meant about you?
And that's it right there. Like that question, that none of it actually meant anything about you. Because as soon as it does, as soon as it feels like it does mean something about you, there's some sort of thing that you feel like you have to do right now that's going to take your attention away from just what's going on. Like as soon as there's some thing that has ever meant something about you, it pulls you from the experience that you're having. Like there's nothing. It's like that sense. And like I don't love the analogy of you being a vehicle, because like it's not, you're not separate. It implies some division and some you. Again, it's like some you, like there has to be you implying that, but there is almost a sense of like it it is, but it's like a vehicle that can't be improved or diminished. Like it's just what it is. You're just what you are your whole life, and you can't improve it. It can't be chipped away at, only if you make assumptions, or only even if, you get judged. It's only your assumption that that means something about you. And therefore, if you bypass that, you're more like,
Oh, I'm digging the visual here, because as much as you don't like the idea of looking at it as a vehicle, right? Because we have no choice. This is something it's really hard, right? Because you have to recognize that the only way for unity, the whole balance to experience itself, is through the observer and the observed. And so you have the environment and you have the vehicle going through the environment. Now, typically when we think about this, we'll envision, say, a car on a road going through a landscape. Okay. But life isn't quite like that. And what I mean is that that road isn't a road, it's an ever changing landscape, which means the road's ever changing, not just as it winds, but it becomes fucking water and vapor and shit, and the environment around you totally changes. Not like all of a sudden you've passed a plant, but all of a sudden it's an entirely different planet, it's an entirely different life, it's an entirely different landscape. What I mean is that it's constant change and chaos, and the vehicle changes with it. We, the vehicle, change with the landscape as we go through our life, because they are one and the same. The observer and the observed are not disconnected. They are one and the same. We change with our environment, because we are the environment as well. We just perceive a difference. We perceive that separation, but they are one whole. This is that idea that unity somehow is, something that is separate from duality, whereas duality is just the expression of unity. And if you recognize that, then there is nothing ever missing from any moment of your existence as the subjective experience of unity. It's just a perception that we get caught in. That's it. It's the idea of yourself that takes you away from the experience of being reality unfolding. We create a journey, and that journey makes us feel like we're less than we will be when we accomplish that journey, as opposed to recognizing that you are the vehicle, and the reality around you is continuing to shift with you, because that is the existence that you embody. You embody existence, which is the experience of duality, which is the experience of movement, forward and backwards, and the experience of others. But we exacerbate that by detaching ourselves from others with our fucking journey. See, because if I'm on a journey somewhere, I am now alone on that journey. I can't hear you. I'm not paying attention to you. It's too important to me to get to the end of that. And worse, I really want to believe that I'm trying to get to the end of that. I really want to believe that's going to set me free. So I need to see you as either agreeing with me, which is why people will idealize you. Oh yeah, no, you definitely see where I'm coming from, until you disagree with them. They're like, what? Hold on. Right? Or you just disagree with them and they're like, oh, you're still in suffering. You're still, you're still doomed like me. Right? And it's always just to validate the fact that everybody's going to be on this fucking trajectory that you're on. They're either farther ahead where you are or farther behind. Whereas the alternative, that they may not be on a trajectory at all and just living in their life, never occurs to you. And a really good test of this, and this is something that I experienced a few times this week. There's documentation on the Discord. We talked about it earlier in the week on another episode, one of the Raws. It's really important to recognize how much you need to convince someone of something. It really is. And the reason is because who are you trying to convince? Because at the end of the day, it's just you. And if you need convincing, then it's just another belief. And if it's just another belief, what's the benefit of that belief outside of false certainty and a sense of control? And so if it's just about you, then it's not about convincing anyone, which means it's just about expressing yourself. But if you're expressing yourself and you're not attached to any kind of trajectory, then expressing whatever path you might view yourself on is never going to be such a need that you are insensitive to the people around you in terms of what they can take, what you're doing, and whether or not you're self-validated. It's really important to recognize that there's an attachment that goes with the journey. And you'll know that if you need to convince somebody else about that journey. That's really one of the biggest tests. This is why I walked away from YouTube when I came out of the forest, because I realized I was getting super involved with trying to educate people, tell people what this was all about. And now I do this because I enjoy the conversation. And I enjoy the fact that the conversation on the podcast is not the conversation that happens in Dualistic Unity. Like this episode is not typically what happens on Dualistic Unity. Dualistic Unity is a series of different groups and events and game nights and movie reviews and all kinds of dope shit. And there's a lot of conversation and just ridiculousness that goes in there. Like there's a lot of play. There's a lot of humor, right? There's a lot of authenticity too. But there really is just an element of we're just hanging out together. Whereas when we talk about this stuff, it seems like we're trying to pass on a message. I just like talking about this shit, honestly, which is why I don't go out of my way to convince anyone of anything. I don't cater any of my videos. This podcast does not have a huge production value by any means, right? Like none of the stuff I create on TikTok, none of the stuff I've ever written ever goes towards saying like, hey, you should pay attention to this because you're going to fucking learn something. It's going to change your life, right? That's why most of my videos start with, it can help to remember that, whatever the video might be. Like it can help if you want to, right? But I'm not saying it because you should or have to. Perhaps the best thing for you right now is to do exactly what you're doing and judge yourself and suffer a bit and learn from that experience. It's an interesting thing, right? This is something I've talked to my own daughter about. The teenage years are really where we get hit with a lot in terms of the emotional spectrum, in terms of that perspective of division, in terms of learning about the environment that we're in and all of the mentalities that make it up collectively and individually and where we fit in all of that. And so there is a whole period where you just got to go through the shit. But going through that shit, feeling left out, feeling separate, feeling like you have to be more and strive forward, having your heart broken, having your dreams crushed, thinking that you can, through achievement or accumulation, be more than other people, and then feeling that gap that forms as a result. These all inform our empathy. These inform our empathy, and without them, it would limit our ability to connect with one another on all of the different levels that we embody as a species. Not just as a species, but as life itself. There's a lot to learn here. And if we're blocking things out according to our preferences, we're never going to learn those things. And so it's in not trying to escape them. In the same way, it's in not being afraid of your anxiety that you find your freedom.
Because it's not something to get rid of. It's not something to overcome. It's not something that even means something about you. It's just something that it's not even it's like to say it's not even a thing isn't the right words necessarily, or the appropriate words that I'm trying to get across. But like your idea of what you have or what you've dealt with or what you're going through isn't what you've thought that it is. And it's not something, because as soon as it means something about you, it needs to be overcome, and it means something about you. And so therefore, until you overcome that, it's like you've never reached your highest self. And fuck, dude. Oh, highest self bullshit. Oh my God. How much of a journey does that keep us on? Holy shit, that there's a place in which I am my highest self somewhere else, some other spot. Couldn't possibly be right now. But you got to let go again. And it's not like get rid of everything. It's not get rid of your belongings, but not see them as meaning anything about you. Just see them as tools, just as tools. When everything's a tool, it doesn't mean anything about you. It's just a means of exploring this, a means of expressing yourself, a way to do things. You know, we got to eat something. Sometimes eat something that tastes pretty good. Sometimes recognize like, is this a habitual pattern? Like just now, before I was eating a couple ham, egg, and cheese wraps, and I was starting to feel myself getting full. And recently, I've been pounding that out. I've just been eating it anyway. And this time around, I was like, I normally just finish this, and I know that in 20 minutes, it's not going to feel great. And it would feel good right now because it's more flavor. I like the flavor. But I just set it down. I put it in the fridge. I sat back down. It was like the first time I've done it in a bit, something like that. And even just that, because it's not about how you feel so much. And it's not about trying to have control. And the other thing you were saying before that I made me think of just suffering and the necessity and the thought of all these motherfuckers, including myself, thinking that it's better to help end someone's suffering than to let them do it, or to think that there's something that you can do, some state of control. It's just buying into control. It's just thinking that you have, getting that sweet, sweet hit of control when someone, you know, for me, post a video, someone comments something, you know, positive, whatever, or like, oh, this was so helpful. Even just that. It's like that's a little hit in the thought that I did something that caused that, and it meant something. It now means something about me, instead of kind of like you were saying, just like, interesting. Blah, 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 blah. And then, there it goes. That's it. Doesn't mean anything, nothing about it. Because as soon as it does, it's buying into me being on a fucking journey and something meaning something about me and me having some state of control. And so even that, like that is so fucking common. I'm helping people. Are you? Are you? Do you have that degree of control? Are you sure? Or is it just this internal sort of narrative that you're telling yourself and it's getting reflected back to a degree because they assume that you're helping them when it's just them doing it, but that keeps them on a trajectory, that keeps you on a trajectory.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that I enjoy about my TikTok channel is that I inevitably piss off people who are both followers and not. Like, it's something I really enjoy because people will follow my channel because they have an idea about me. And then sometimes they'll leave a comment that's complimentary, but on the same token, super self-validating in terms of the trajectory that we're getting somewhere together. And I'm just like, oh man, okay, I gotta say something about this. I gotta stop on this, right? Because they might like me. They might be like, you are really helping me. But am I? If I'm not willing to point out something despite their pleasantry, like, somebody doesn't have to come across as an asshole for there to be something for them to learn. There is a way to be an asshole very pleasantly, where you are looking for self-validation from the other person by being so overtly nice about it. Like, I love you. We're in this together. I'm just saying, right? The person I was talking to earlier in the week, for example, by the time we got through the conversation of I'm not trying to run from suffering, there's something to learn there, and I don't necessarily share your path, it suddenly became like, you're very arrogant, and that means that you have something that you need to heal, and therefore I'm going to help you and I'm going to heal you. And that's exactly where that went almost immediately. And it was just because all of a sudden the ideal of me, which agreed with everything that they wanted to see in their own path, was shattered because it was paper thin to begin with. And it's so important to recognize that everybody that you look at, if you put them up on a pedestal, or even if you tear them down, that shit's paper thin. They're just as complex and full of potential as you are. But that means they're just as prone to bullshit. They can bullshit themselves very easily in the same way that you and I can. And it's just being willing to recognize it and not judge it. That's it. I'm not judging that person. They're pretty pissed at me right now because I went back and forth and I actually created some video responses because they just wouldn't let up on the DMs. And so finally, I'm like, all right, I'm just going to respond to your comments publicly so at least I can bring your attention back here. Because there's a trail of messages where I'm like, okay, now you need to stop messaging me. Blah, 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 blah. No, you need to stop right now. Blah, 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 blah. And this went on for a bit. And then what's funny is they're like, oh, what are you talking about? Like, I've always stopped as soon as you mention it. And then I'm like, stop again. And then so I went back to the comment section and that's where that video came up where they're like, I stop every time you ask. It's like, the fact that there's an every time implies that you're not stopping. Right. And that's but you don't want to see that because it's very important that you get across your point. It's very important that you be heard and validated and make me agree with you. Why is it that important? Why? And the answer is because you doubt it. And you doubt it because you know it's not going to fix it. You're just running from it. Just looking for another escape from the reality that this is reality. That's quite it. Okay. But your devotion to escaping the illusion is, in fact, your devotion to the illusion.
And every time you think there's something that you got to overcome or get over, or something that someone else has to overcome and get over, like even that like, things like you mentioned arrogance before, that arises, that expressed. Maybe I express something that could be deemed as arrogant to someone, could be deemed as confident to someone else. Who knows? It's not objective arrogance. And it doesn't mean that I'm arrogant, because as soon as it means that I'm arrogant and you have a judgment that arrogance is something that needs to be changed or subdued, like it's on this spectrum where it's like arrogance on one end and like pleasant on the other, or whatever I don't know, whatever the opposite of arrogant is, there's a spectrum. And if you assume that like arrogance is on one side and that isn't the correct thing to express, and immediately you're like, oh, they must be an arrogant person. They are now on a trajectory to you, and they should be doing things in order to overcome their arrogance. It's almost like we assume that it becomes inherent to us and what we are, instead of all these things, all the ways that you see yourself not being inherent at all, but just being things that could be expressed, that could be interpreted in a certain way. And like, that's kind of the extent. Because like, if you're saying that there's, you know, that suffering is informative and it's not something to overcome, because as soon as it's something that should be overcome, you're either in suffering or out of suffering, but on this continuous up and down. And it's not to say that you're not, it's not to say that you aren't, but it's not, it's something that like moves through you instead of you moving through it. Like, where you continue to be you, going through things instead of going through things for a purpose or for a reason to be overcome, or like something that means something about you, that like when you're in spots where, because then it's like you're either suffering and you're working your way out to get to peace, or peace, or whatever word you want to use, or you're there and you're afraid of suffering again, instead of not having so much of even an idea. And that's where uncertainty plays in, because like, you don't know, but that's not a scary thing. It's like, this is life right now. You're not what you think. You don't know what's happening. Of course you don't know what's to come. Of course you don't know what things have meant about you. It's like, seems obvious, but this is just it. And so it's like, well, I don't know anything. It's like, you've never known anything. You've just thought things to distract yourself from not being able, from seeing everything as a vehicle that's the same. It's like the same sort of, I don't know why I'm picturing like a circular cylindrical garbage can with wheels on it, but like, that's just everyone. And it's all gray or blue or whatever color you want. And they're all the same, just kind of wheeling around the world. And also the world is it. And like, there's just no way to build yourself up or tear yourself down, because like, everyone's you, everyone's the same thing. So the thought of like this spectrum of judgment doesn't even make it, like, it can't even happen. It's just, recognition of behavior, but not something that means something about them, just something that's being expressed right now.
It's funny because it immediately made me think of Hurricane Katrina, because it's a good example of how humanity has changed over time. Because humanity used to be nomadic, which means we moved with the weather. We moved as the environment changed, as everything else in nature does. It doesn't try to fight the environment, it adapts to the environment. But now humanity has this illusion of control. And so all of a sudden, Hurricane Katrina is coming towards New Orleans. And they know it's going to overwhelm the levees. They know it's going to fucking hammer that city. And there were people that just refused to leave. They just refused to leave. Instead, they just stood up on their roof with a sign that says, "Go away, Katrina." You can actually see the shot if you go and look for it. And it's just because the fear of leaving everything they knew, of leaving their home, their community, the life, the day-to-day life that they were experiencing, and suddenly going inland to a new place and to possibly a new life where all of a sudden they have to face all of this uncertainty. It was preferable to just go dig in. Right? And we do that in so many different ways in our life. We just resist the suffering. We resist the storm. We're like, no, I'm going to sit here. I'm not going to be informed by the storm. It's like the storm is telling you to move. The storm is telling you you are entrenched in a certain idea. And it's going to batter the fuck out of you until you just let that idea go and learn that you're the storm. It's the only reason the resistance is there, right? You're trying to move and you're anchoring yourself. And so as you do that, the storm builds. You don't have to resist change. You don't have to resist who you are. right? In the same way that we don't have to resist all of the things that are happening in nature right now. We could be informed by it, which is what happens in evolution. The animals that continue on are the animals that adapt. The animals that don't are the animals that don't adapt, that instead sit there going, oh God, this is all happening. We don't want to give up our way of life, though. And life just comes rolling over.
Oh, yes. I definitely, yeah. And so, like, on this episode and just having this conversation and not being on, like, feeling like there's any sort of journey whatsoever to anything, like, to me, it's something that means something about me. Like, there's sort of a clarity that you see, like environment, for example, like there has been personal resistance to environmental changes for sure. And like part of me feels like the person standing on their roof and with the Hurricane Katrina coming and being like, go away, Katrina. Like, yeah, that story, it hit, and it's not like it isn't something that I'm not aware of also, like, when you're oh, man, dude. Oh my goodness gracious. Like how much and I guess, like we've talked about me, like, just being in New York right now for me and it being, like, sort of a yeah, like a last ditch effort to hold on to control or like what I want or fight a shifting environment. Like it's very much it's been like back and forth because it's not to say that I don't there's not something deeper down that I've been feeling that like maybe feel like I'm feeling more right now, whatever the fuck that means. I'm just not trying to think that I should improve something about myself or assuming that I should improve something about myself. But there is also with that, like the realization that you are your environment and like it changes with you. And like if it's like a fascinating sort of experience where like I've almost there's been a sense of forgetting almost and times in my life where maybe I felt more relaxed and not as hesitant. And then when I am feeling less of that, whatever that means, there's almost an immediate looking at myself and like previous, myself from a year ago and just like judging the fuck out of myself only because I'm still judging myself right now, only because I still see myself on that same trajectory where it's like I'm further along that trajectory instead of just being here. Instead of just being like, no, fucking blue garbage can with wheels on it. Same thing as the whole fucking time. And so it's been so funny because, like, I'm still sitting in New York right now and feeling like, there's nowhere to get, nothing to be. But it's not to say that, like, because I've felt that sort of felt that before for sure. And that's feeling of just yeah, it's just being really relaxed basically. But previously I feel like I've had more of an assumption that like this is going to last through everything and like that's not it at all because it's again assuming that right now there's even a experience that I'm having that's separate from anything or experience that I'm going through that I can then not go through and I'll be in a different experience. And like you'll be in the same experience just with different feelings that maybe you're more closely attached to that are going to suck you into a story and kind of that pull of like, the ego to unity sort of Hawkins scale pull. It's like there can be a gravity to that. And so, New York City is kind of like maybe most egotistical city in the world. So, and Vancouver Island, for example, maybe closer to the other end of that spectrum, but it's like informative of the environment because it's like it's straight up a concrete jungle, concrete situation. Like 2 days ago, I was feeling very relaxed. And then yesterday, I think I had some, sort of blowback to that relaxation that I felt or something. And I was feeling all sorts of stuff then. And yeah, it's just like a back and forth. And maybe I'm like feeling New York in a lot of ways, whatever that means, because I'm not separate from it. And it's like, yeah, there's the perception, but like the reality is that, you're not separate from your environment at all. And so you're always feeling everything all the time. It's just, where is that? I don't know, closer to?
It's interesting because there have been a lot of really cool inventions throughout history that never took off. And the reason they never took off wasn't because they weren't cool, but because either the mentality of the people wasn't in the right place where the thing could be accepted, right, or even believed to exist, right, that kind of thing. And so there was no investment in it, and these inventions just kind of got forgotten over time. And the same is, I guess, true for everything else. And what I mean is that it's not just about the idea, it's not just about the insight, it's about the environment and whether or not the environment aligns to receive it. And so I don't know if I've ever shared this, but over the 20 plus years before the podcast, again, like, nothing's really changed for me except just the integration of seeing all this shit. But it's always been in there, and I've always kind of had this feeling that I should be expressing it to some degree, but life always led me in directions where it's like, no, now you have to be a salesman. No, now you're going to be a construction worker. And no, now you're going to be, and always in directions where I wasn't necessarily doing anything with this. And then when I became a life coach, I discovered it's not about talking about what I want to talk about. It's about being informed by the situation with the client, by being informed by the client as a whole. And so there's this nagging fucking feeling. It's like, oh, fuck, like, why have all this if not to do something useful with it? And that's when eventually I'm like, oh, right, I am doing something useful with it. I'm living my life. Oh my God. But what's interesting about that is that just like an invention, it's not just about the idea, it's about the timing and the receptivity of the environment. The same is true for you as a person, right? Like, you are a part of the world. And so it's not just you going through something, though that's how you perceive it. It's the entire environment going through something, right? Which is really interesting because that means that you can be insightful as a motherfucker, and then all of a sudden the environment changes to make use of it. But that could take forever. And the whole point is just to make it about you because you are the environment. And the more you can just accept that and let go of this fictitious you, the more you start to see that in front of you all the time. But it's just really interesting because it's this feeling that you're like, no, I've got to do something with these insights. It's like, you are, but possibly right now, the environment doesn't require you to do more than just recognize that insight. Right? Maybe the environment doesn't match the vehicle you want to be right now based on how you see your progress. But the environment does perfectly match the vehicle regardless, which means that person who doesn't want to hear you talking about unity consciousness, that's the environment you are. It's not what you prefer to be, but it's the environment you are. And there's something in that to learn from if you can just let go of the fictitious path that you were so determined to talk to that person about.
Oh, goodness. Because, like, the conversation can very much become something that means something about you. It's just as much a pull, like any sort of even way of expressing. It's like we could go in any different direction anytime we want. I could start talking about Kraft mac and cheese and how good the Scooby-Doo ones were. growing up and how they had multiple colors and like just something about that Kraft artificial mac and cheese that like, yeah, a restaurant version with the breadcrumbs and shit is good, but like nothing really compared. There was something about the ridges in like in the characters. It was just so goddamn good. So like we can bring up anything we want and talk about anything because there isn't any reason for me to say something super insightful. It's just something else that's on the table and it can be fun to talk about, but it's like the sort of like who said it? Alan Watts, like when you hear the message, hang up the phone, something like there can be sort of this addictive pull because to anything that you feel like you're getting good at, you get really good at playing baseball, become a professional athlete, and like that can mean something about you, or like it could also not. Like you could do that, and that would be kind of like, whoa, could someone do that? Could someone actually like just try all these things and almost become like, yeah, it's that jack of all trades sort of thing because how much is there? How much potential is in each and every person that they have all these assumptions that keeps them from expressing to the point that now it's like we've gotten so far from jack of all trades because we think what we do means something about us that we can only really take in like one thing to really focus on because we're getting chipped away at every single time we do it because we think it means something about us. And so we have a very, very limited potential to the point that, someone being even, like a pro athlete in two sports, it's like for someone who's insanely athletic, you would think, maybe they could do it a couple different ones. And obviously it takes a lot of, focus, but like it's kind of mind blowing for someone to have two, despite a lot of them not being too different. And it's like, how much of that is because we chip away at our own potential by thinking that, it means something about us instead of just being reality each and every moment, not doing things for a reason that means something about me, but just doing things because no, that's something I want to focus on right now.
Well, this is it. This is why we become afraid to go on to another path once we've become good at one path. Like, no, I'm defined by how good I am at this path. It's like, you're not, though, at all. Like, you're still the same person that you were before you ever started that path. And if you start another path, you're going to feel exactly the same. And that's why all of a sudden you feel like you backslid, is because you were invested in this idea that you were more. So you never actually backslid because you never actually were more. Right? And that's the whole thing about the journey. And that's the point. It's just to be where you are. You're going to keep feeling different things. And that's it. And you're going to go through it and you're going to express it and you're going to be what you are. But we want a journey where we can be more. We want a journey where we can validate ourselves. We want a journey, and it's just because we think we need it, because we want to think we need it, because the alternative is to just be where we are. But again, what is the end of the path that you envision other than to be free here? Because even to say there's an end of the path where there is an end to suffering, whether it's Christianity believing in heaven or a non-dualist believing in the cessation of the I sense, whatever that might be, that path out of suffering will never find a way out of suffering because the path itself is a source of suffering. But to accept that the suffering that you create for yourself is different than the suffering created for you by reality itself, is fundamental. It helps to understand that when somebody broke your heart, it wasn't necessarily personal, that it wasn't because of you. But the reason it hurts is because you very much think it was. Right? And so to recognize that suffering is exacerbated by your commitment to your idea of you being defined by any of this stuff, by what anybody does. And it's just to let that shit go. That means that you're left with the actual suffering of life. And this is where it's really important. I wanted to make this video earlier, and I didn't, but it was about this idea that reality is an illusion. There's a part of that that's true. Okay? But it also is fundamentally not true. And what I mean is that an illusion isn't real. So you can actually think to yourself, well, suffering is an illusion created by my investment in the ego. And that type of suffering, yep, for sure. Arthritis, somebody punching you in the face, bashing your toe on the coffee table, it's not really the result of your resistance. That feeling of suffering, that's not really the result of your resistance. The events that led up to it, possibly, because you weren't paying attention, right? But that experience is very real. When you are suffering through, chronic illness, that experience is very real. But the question is how much are you exacerbating that experience through focusing on a fiction that's taking away your ability to heal, right? But that doesn't mean that reality is an illusion just because it is influenced by your mentality or influenced by your level of resistance. That doesn't make this an illusion because it's the definition of reality. It's the experience of yourself. But we confuse this. It's like, no, there's truth. There's unity. There's unity. And then there's this shit. And we actually do that. We actually convince ourselves, like, in unity, there is no fluctuation. There is no back and forth. It's like, how would you experience that? Because in unity, there's no you to experience it.
Jay threw a question in here. I'll throw it on. Is suffering related to the value you place on anything? Like, without a perceived value, how could I be disappointed? I think in terms of that psychological suffering, like, it's one thing, for the kicking your toe on the coffee table or getting smacked in the face. I guess the value in not feeling that maybe exacerbates a little bit. Sometimes I do sort of test out if I do stub my toe, just like more recently, I guess, just like how quick I can relax, and like there can be a more quicker dissipation almost, instead of, or if I judge myself for even if I judge myself for stubbing my toe and being like, fuck, why did I do that? I wish I didn't do that. It's like that. It's like the pain sort of like stays amplified with it. And so I wonder about that sometimes, but with the psychological, yes.
I have a question. If you didn't experience pain bashing your toe, how would you be informed that you hit something?
Oh gosh. Yeah. Of course, because it's just a response. The stove's super hot. You put your hand on the stove. If you don't feel pain, you're gonna die after a couple minutes. It's oh my God, it's like a buffer to keep yourself alive. So it's not even, it's just an indicator. It's like a boop, like in Sir, what is it? The one where the game where you have the little piece and you pull the bones out. Surgeon.
Doctor, I think it's something like that.
Doctor, something like that. I think everyone knows. And you get a little vibration when you hit the side or something. It's like pain's always that. It's like you do that for too long and you're probably gonna die. Like even from a little, I don't know, your hangnail getting pulled off. It's like you peel that skin all the way off and around your body. It's like that's going to keep hurting and that's going to get you closer and closer. I don't know if that's even something that could happen. I'm thinking of like when you open something on a plastic thing and you have to peel around like a pack of gum. It's like that's what I feel like, but for your skin. Oh, like Jesus Christ, it's getting.
I have actually seen that meme. I've
on
actually seen
skin?
that. It's like me when I find a hangnail and I'm a perfectionist, and so they show the hangnail, and then the next image is just a skeleton with bones and with like muscles and whatnot, and there's no skin, and it's like don't pick at it, right?
Oh my god, okay, so I don't think I've ever seen that,
And the
but
game was called Operation. Thank you.
Operation. Yes, yes. I don't think I've ever seen that, but that's exactly what I was picturing, was, like, pulling it all the way to that satisfaction where you bring it back to, like, the tip or something, and then, you can peel off from both directions and step out of it like a Scooby-Doo villain or something, but, the yeah, so that sort of pain, but I think the psychological pain isn't too much different. Like, it's an indicator. It's an indicator of something you're attached to, something keeping you assuming something about something else in reality. Like that there is something else, that there is something separate from you that either you need or it needs you, or you need it to need you, or you thought you needed. Any of it, like that as that shifts and changes, it's like that psychological pain and suffering is an indicator of something you believe to be separate from you, or something that should or shouldn't be happening, something that you thought you had control over that you don't.
You know, it's funny because there's a part of me that's hesitant to say this because I know it will be misconstrued. So bear with me if you can, dear listener. I don't really suffer anymore. It's something I've noticed in the last week or two, especially. And it's not that I don't experience sadness or disappointment or frustration or any of that stuff. I just don't think I shouldn't. I'm just very aware of those experiences and I never pile shit on top of them. I allow them to be the experience that I'm having. And as a result, what I used to consider suffering is now just life. Because even the perspective that it is suffering is really dependent on preference. Which goes back to what Jay was asking. Is suffering related to the value that we place on anything? I think suffering very much ties to this idea that things have different value at all, that value is something that is measurable, that the experience of going to the bar and having fun with your friends is somehow more valuable than the experience of sitting at home grinding through an arduous fucking task. And because we place value based on what's pleasant or not, I think that very much our frustration and our expectations are based on that entirely. I think it's a damn good question, because again, as Jay said, without a perceived value, how could I be disappointed? Without a perceived difference in value, how can you have a preference?
Oh, because the preference is based on where I see the value in one versus the other, or how I just what that preference is that reinforces me, myself, as something that it's like if you think you need an experience to be different, like it'll mean something about you, or there'll be a draw to certain experiences over other experiences, or based on, fears or concerns or potential uncertain viewpoints of yourself or about yourself. Like all of those are sort of indicators of where you see yourself as separate, like things that are reinforcing you as something else, as something that's immediately back on back on that path, like back on something that is on in this spectrum of measurement, or like based on a way that you act your value goes up or down. And based on a concern about how you act, your value goes up and down. Or assuming that a thing, happening or experience happening, like, is indicative of where you're at, and then you have to do something in order to counteract it, in order to then get rid of it, instead of just being like, this is what it is right now. It doesn't mean something about me, and it's not indicative of something that I'm still holding on to even. It's just what it is, because as soon as it's indicative of something about me, it's something that is in process. It's something, it puts me in process instead of just living. Instead of just, nope, I'm just living right now. But, as we focus on certain preferences over others, we get pulled into some sort of journey, trajectory, path. And I say pulled in, but it's not even, it's really like step in, step into.
It's a lot like the experience of VR, if you want to think about it that way. Careful with that. Don't take that too far. And what I mean is that when you go and play in, say, a VR arcade, and you get hooked up and you're on that thing where when you're walking, you're not going anywhere, right? But you're still experiencing it in the game like you're going somewhere, like you're walking around shooting fucking aliens and shit, right? But you actually haven't left. You're just moving around and walking in the same spot, right? And you haven't moved. There's actually no journey happening, despite your experience of a journey happening. If you can keep that in mind with this, that although you feel like you are going somewhere and becoming something, you have never left the here and now that you've always been and will always be.
Oh man, I really like that analogy there of the VR, because it's like you get so lost in it and then assume that. And on top of that, and where people take this is thinking that, oh, it means I have control of the VR instead of just experiencing it. Because as soon as you think there's control, it's buying into it being real. Like, instead of being VR, like, if you think if you're playing, say, a VR game and you assume there's control, then there's some path that you're on to getting more control. Oh fuck. It's then having more control. You need to attain these things. You need to do these things. You need to, hook up with these people or get this amount of money or buy this amount of house, so you have more control, and you're just continuing, because, like, you have all this stuff. Certainly more people, you're going to get more of what you want, more adoration, more partners, more things, more this, more people to like you, is if you have all of this control. But then it's no longer a game, then it's no longer that sort of VR. So it's like, this is kind of VR with no control. It is what it is, and you don't have any. And again, I say this, like, yeah, careful with the VR stuff, because there's like, oh, so it's not real, so I can do anything. It's like, if you're experiencing what's going on, like, what's pulling you into certain situations or assumptions, if it is the case that you recognize. Because even going with the VR thing and just being like, say hypothetically this was that, then it's just control that's pulling you in one direction or another, instead of just fully experiencing the VR right now without so many pulls or reasons for doing things outside of just being informed by what's happening right now.
Oh, we got to keep running with this. Okay. So, what I love about the VR thing is that, of course, you're responding to what you're seeing. You're invested in the game. Like what you're saying there about, like you're trying to live up to the expectations, you're trying to make more money, you're trying to have control in the game. In the game, right? So, it's not quite like you have a VR set where you're wearing it and not moving, but you have a VR set while you're in reality. So while you are walking through reality, you have a VR set that is showing you something else, something that you need to see on top of reality. And it reminded me of a scene, and I'm almost certain it's from the second Johnny English. But basically, this guy has a VR set and he's hooked up to the machine that stops him from walking, and somehow he ends up detaching from it, and he's in like a spy training simulator, and the people who are watching him went for a break, and so he ends up leaving the building thinking that he's moving through this spy simulator, and he comes across people and they're enemies in the game, and they're just random people. Like, he walks into a fucking coffee shop, he grabs what looks like a weapon in the game, it's a fucking like baguette, and he starts beating the dude behind the counter with the baguette because he sees the person as the enemy in the game. So while the reality is happening and there's real people paying the price of the game that he's playing, he doesn't even see them because of the game that he's invested in. And so it immediately brought me back to that scene, because that's very much what we're doing. Because when you do the VR thing, people are like, oh, so there's a reality. There's a reality outside the simulation. It's like the simulation is your perception of this. You know, the illusion is how you view yourself in this, because it removes you from what's actually happening. All right. And that's not a bad thing. You can dip in and out of that all the time, and you will, because it's a product of having the fucking VR set on. And by VR set, I mean having a brain, being in this dualistic reality, right? But the point is to keep it in mind, you know, not to get so carried away in the game, because every time you get carried away in the game, it becomes more and more what you see, and you see less and less of reality. So it's almost like your VR set's not a VR set, but it's actually transparent until you believe what you're seeing. And then it starts to superimpose reality itself. The more you believe in the image you're seeing in the VR set, the less you can see the reality. That's really good.
Oh, man. And like, it's almost that, like, if you go on like a deeper, like, take a bunch of mushrooms or something, and like signs, labels, things kind of become very irrelevant for a bit. And then you kind of come back and everything kind of settles in. So it's like there's a shift there, a degree of a shift, but then it's like it settles. It's like it's settling back in to it, and it means something about you. And immediately, based on your perception of yourself, based on how you're seeing yourself, that environment is almost going to reflect that based on how you're seeing it. You know, like for myself, when I get really caught in my stuff and worried and anxious and nervous and all that stuff, I see everyone else as not being as nervous as me, because I have to, almost, because like I see myself in a certain way and everyone else must not. They must not, because for me to focus on this, if the case was, say, hypothetically, that, you know, I was feeling this and everyone else was feeling more, it's like there wouldn't be a way for me to feel so much a certain way about myself or keep focusing on myself. There would be more attention paid to the rest of myself, you know, reality. And so even the assumption that you're like you see yourself in a certain way, or someone who experiences a certain thing is going to cut you off from seeing reality again, and seeing that, you know, again, a bunch of blue garbage cans wheeling around, everyone having their stuff, everyone having their things, because they're, as long as they think they've made progress in their life, there's more progress to be made. So it's like, it's very indicative, even assuming like, fuck, even assuming that you've improved implies that there's another you out there that's more improved. And so you're suffering to some degree, as long as like I like no one's improved themselves. No one's been diminished. Like no one's actually, as much as it seems like, oh, I have improved. It's like you've just gone through a lot of different experiences and you're informed by all those experiences. And that is it. It doesn't mean something about you. It's not like but that's how, and that's pride. That's on that spectrum. That's pride, assuming that I was somewhere and now I'm somewhere else. Someone else is here and I'm here. That gap between where you saw your previous self and where you see your current self, where you see someone else and where you see yourself, where you see someone who, you're proud of, you see that they have made progress on this spectrum, but therefore couldn't possibly be at the end of that progress. They couldn't possibly be at the end of the road. They couldn't possibly be at the end of the line. They couldn't just be living right now, because now they have more to improve. And if you see them as less than you, then there's a gap right there that they could improve to where you're at, to how much you've let go of, to how much you've overcome, to how much you've done, how much you can do right now. And so everyone's on like this, even just indicated based on you thinking that you've improved anything at all, puts you on a journey. You're in somewhere on a path, instead of just, wandering around this path like fucking field with no sense of a direction, no certainty, and no idea about how you're doing, because why would you need that? It's like there's all this.
It's so interesting because, again, we confuse the process, right? Like, I am going through this. It's like, well, you are the experience of going through this, and you view it as I, right? And that's kind of where we get caught. We're like, I'm making progress. It's like, no, you're progress experienced as I, right? It's not even progress so much as ongoing expression as a whole. But I want to say, because we're going to wrap up this episode very quickly here, that I am delighted that we made no progress whatsoever in this episode, because there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go. The me that's trying to escape is ultimately the me that's being dissolved. This idea of myself that I'm trying to get away from, that experience is the process of it slipping away. Right? But there comes a point where you have to let go of the letting go, where the path out of suffering actually is recognized as the reinforcement of that suffering. And at first it feels really good, because of course it does. It's like, I've been suffering this whole time. Suddenly it makes sense why I'm suffering. It's starting to come together. I'm moving my way out. The insights never change, though. The insights are always the same, and they're always the same because you can stop anytime you like. The question is, how attached are you to the you that's on a journey? And who would you be if you didn't have that journey? And that's the unknown. And that's what we're so afraid to find out. And yet, despite our fear, that's exactly what we're finding out. And we're working through that fear. I could say together, but that just means as one. But in order for us to work through it, we got to look at it, stop running from it, be informed by it. And that's really all this process is. And the best thing that you can do for yourself is just allow it to happen, and stop thinking that just because it's unpleasant, it shouldn't be happening.
Very true. Very true. And that idea that even you have control over your progress, this assumption that like there's something I can do to make progress, instead of just being informed by what you're doing as you go. Because like there's certain points where, thoughts were always something I saw as like an enemy, instead of something that's informative, and like, oh, thoughts aren't real, thoughts aren't the truth, blah 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 blah. But like, yeah, there's just certain insights and realizations that you have a preference over, and certain ones that you don't, maybe. But all of them are just preference. And so it's like they're all indicative of of your changing self. And that's it. It's just there's sides of that are tougher to let go of than others, but it's not even like it means that there's something for you to do. It's just like the veil on the VR, like assuming that it means something, assuming that a situation means something. Because even that, like, like being in New York, for example, that was a big part. Like, that was always growing up a city I knew I wanted to live in. It was a place that I had a lot of friends and family, and it was a place that was a component of like me growing up being like, I'm gonna live in New York one day. And like, but I never saw it as like, I'm gonna live in New York forever. It was just, it was something that I wanted to experience. And it was very, you know, informative for me in a lot of ways. And it has been a lot of fun to experience. And again, it's like, I don't know what the rest of my life is going to bring at all. And it's funny because I never did. Like, I never really did. And it's funny how, like, you can go through things in your life and, like, how time doesn't really work in one direction. It's like, who knows what, right now you're going through that's informing something else. And you just have certain draws to certain things, or maybe not as drawn to certain things for certain reasons. And there's other things that you're more drawn towards. And it's all informative, and it's all happening. It's not that it's happening perfectly at all, but like it's happening as you, and like how much are you recognizing that it's happening as you? Because it's not just you. Like, that's why I think so many people that on our Patreon calls, especially recently, it sounds like everyone's going through some variation of the same sort of thing, same sort of stuff. Because like, we're going through it based on the experiences we've had, but that's just it. It's not that we're going through something separate. It's that you're going through something, and you're just not, confined to the thing that you've assumed. And it's not that you're not that also. It's just not all that you are. And so it's going to be reflective based on what you're going through, where you're at all the time. And even when it seems like, oh, it's not, it's like, it still is. And things have a way of playing out. It doesn't mean, again, it's not like you're doing something wrong necessarily. Like, even me right now being in New York, like, it's not an incorrect thing by any means, but there's an environment that's very much full of distractions that I don't feel as much a need. Like, I'm not, especially like right now, like, the thought of distraction is like, that seems kind of silly. Like, why would I want to distract myself from living life? But when you're when you're assuming that you've been somewhere and are getting somewhere, and when you've assumed that you've improved, or you've, or that you've not improved and you've gone the other direction, like I've been feeling a lot more recently, like, oh my gosh, have I gone in a completely other direction? It's like, you're going to want to distract yourself from that. It's like, either way, there's you got to have a way of coping with that process, that the coping with an assumption that, like, the VR game is absolutely real and means something about you. The more you buy into it as truth, instead of like, oh, this is where I'm at right now, being informed by things, taking it in. And when the measurement isn't there quite so much, it's like, there isn't a reason to distract from all your assumptions, because you're just not making so many anymore.
Well, that's just it. This is where the whole manifestation, law of attraction shit is unfortunately rooted, right? But the more that you are allowing yourself to let go of all of that, the more opportunity you just see in front of you, because you're not so distracted. Straight up, right? Like, those years where I'm like, oh, this stuff's in my head, why can't I do anything with it? The fact is that if I had met you at that point, I would have had a need to tell you something, because I still had a need to have that conversation with myself. See, as long as I need to dialogue with myself about this, I need to dialogue with you. right? But when I'm by myself, I don't talk about this shit. You know, if you come to a retreat, you'll notice I don't talk about a lot of intellectual, philosophical, religious stuff at the retreat. I just hang out, right? And it's because I have no need to have this conversation whatsoever, because the conversation is not the point, right? And so all that time where I'm like, why can't I do something with this? It's because I had to work through the need to do something with it, right? And then when I finally did, and I stopped making it about anybody, that's when all of this started to happen. And not only was the environment receptive to it in terms of all of the people who are currently supporting dualistic unity and listening to dualistic unity and contributing to dualistic unity, right? But I was in a mindset where it meant nothing about me. Because if it did, I could have poisoned all of this from the start.
Oh, and it's fascinating how that, like, even that experience you had of, like, feeling the urge to express and, like, wanting something because it's like there's a component of it that means something about you still. Like, there's a side of it that still means something, and that falls on both sides. Like, there's not it's such a beautifully unsatisfying sort to the ego, of course, because it's like, no, you've actually haven't ever made any progress ever, and you're never gonna make any progress again. You're here, but you're here, but you're here, and then and it's like depending on how much value you place in the things that you've done, the progress that you've made, things that you've achieved, things that you're striving towards, and your goals, and all this. There's going to be oh fuck my thought just like I was on some sort of thing and it just like whoop. But the this assumption, and I feel like there's some, and I don't even remember what I just said, and there's some symbolism and beautiful symbolism in that, and just how everything is just you're just here. Fuck, dude, I lost, and it'll come back in like 2 seconds, but I'll let you talk for a second.
Does it need to come back? Is there anything to say? To me, this seems like the perfect place to end this episode. Right here, right now, with no tied up ribbon to conclude it with, but just the ongoing experience of your life now. So thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone.